Parents' names, I should.
Oh, my dad was Louis Backman,
Louis?
born in 1887 in Hoffman, Minnesota. And my mother was Edith Miller, born in 1915 in Golden Prairie, Saskatchewan. Her parents had immigrated from Gita Springs, Kansas in 1908. And the item of interest about Gita Springs is in the past year or two they passed the town bylaw that everybody to remain a citizen of Gita Springs, Kansas has to own a firearm.
No.
They're on the edge of the Ozarks. So my father's family, when they had immigrated from Sweden in 1880 and had settled in first in Illinois and then in Minnesota. And in 1902, Grandpa and the family had moved to east central Saskatchewan near Yorkton, a small town called Marchwell. And they farmed and attempted to ranch there for 10 years until 1912 when my father homesteaded here at Cypress Lake, that they moved to this country. And I guess the main reason my father homesteaded here is he hated wet and trees and bush, and he wanted to find somewhere where it didn't rain all the time and where there's no trees, and he was successful. I think he well, my uncle was married to one of my dad's sisters. He had been a friend that my dad had met, and he mentioned that he found this area south of the Cypress Hills that had some good land for homesteading. So he had filed, so he brought my dad down here to file on the homestead. And quarter where my dad homestead, my brother still lives there. The place where we live here, one of my uncles had homesteaded here, and when he had moved to BC during the 30s, another uncle had lived on this place, and we moved here in 1980 and built our house and have lived here since. Like my wife's, it had the biggest trees and the best view in the country, so that's where she wanted to build the house. By chance, the quarter that my father homesteaded on, he was able to get a well quite early, and as such as that, he was able to have a livestock operation, because with no water you couldn't very well water calves or that sort of thing. So he had livestock. This yard was always short of water. So my uncles who lived here, they would have a team of horses or a milk cow or that sort of thing, but that was about the limit of what they would have for livestock, because the lake was available in the summertime, but winter water, there's nothing. The well. So a well was very important in determining where people eventually came. The farms that survived through the 30s and that, for a reason people lived there because they had water. They were the places that remained occupied. And my dad's homestead had a good well on it. When my brother and I started farming, we got more cattle. We found out there was a limit to that. And so in the 70s, we had bought a place out of Consul, which was Norman Tenberg's ranch, and it was on Battle Creek, so there was year-round water supply, a very good well. And the family moved to about a 300-cow operation from 60 cows, and his yard had adequate water to water any number of animals a person might want. So that was the reason that we no longer have cattle up here, as we outgrew the water supplies.
Wow.
And this yard, Sheila has made it a lifelong occupation that she's going to have water for her trees and her flowers and her garden. So we have worked at many things trying to get a pipeline and a water supply system to pump from Cypress Lake. But Cypress Lake is a very shallow lake, and we found that we've had difficulty pumping water, getting a water source out there. But we recently bought a different inlet screen that allows us to pump from a shallow water source. So we've been able to get water in the yard the past couple of years on a dependable basis. When the PFRA had taken over the Richard McKinnon irrigation project, people became aware that there was going to be land parceled out to different people. And my dad he had good sights on this one quarter there. That was going to be his favorite. He didn't have very high priority for getting it. But as the stars lined up, he was able to get the quarters that he wanted, and it had been the old pre-railroad community of Kelvinhurst. It had been the headquarters of the Richardson Ranch.
And where's that? Where would that be located?
2 miles north of Concord.
Okay.
On Battle Creek, just downstream of where the McKinnon Weir is right now.
Okay.
I think you may have been out to the irrigation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
work.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been to the quarter downstream from where the McKinnon Weir is. And that had been the site. It had some trees and various things on it. That had been the site my dad wanted. And it was always the dream of Mom and Dad that that's where they were going to build their house, where it would be closer to town and better for getting to schools and all those sort of things. But as things worked out, that never happened. The quarter just became an irrigation quarter for raising feed, and we maintained living on the site up north here. And each year, you built something more, it just became that much less feasible to move. And I've never regretted, because horrible mosquitoes on the irrigation flats. Just as it was for a ranch, the water supply was extremely important, so everybody got that. And then the grazing supply was less difficult to obtain. So the fight for wintering cattle or having water was the first thing we got, and then the grazing permits and the grazing leases was second. The so much interesting thing is that this should really be livestock country, because it's dry. Grain is just on the fringe of being able to be successful in grain farming. But the one thing about livestock farms and livestock operations, they're always a high labor input compared to grain farming. And when you get into the situation of having to put up feed and that, it's one of my things that I can remember from my childhood is all the hard work that was always involved with the haying process. Before I was old enough to work, I can remember come haying time, Dad would always...
Before you were old enough to work, do you remember working?
Well, I could remember everybody else how hard they worked, lining up the haying crew, the farmers and that didn't have cattle. They would have a quiet time in the summer, so they were available to hire. So you'd have a crew that run the mowers and the rakes, and then building the sacks with long hay, and so hauling the loads of feed from the hay flats to the wintering yards. And it was very high manpower. The ranches were able to achieve it because they would have, with the reserve at Maple Creek, most of them had connections to a family or that's worked traditionally with this given ranch, and that's what their labor supply was from the native population. But starting in the 1950s, haying was mechanized, the hay baler, and then the mechanical bale wagon, and then eventually the round baler, and the tractor loader took 90% of the physical work out of hay. And it was probably the best memory in my life is when you no longer had to ride on skids behind the baler in that space.
That was the hallelujah moment.
That was when farming didn't seem so bad anymore. I don't know if I want to be a university professor if we don't have to stack bales by hand.
Here you go. Wow.
And we got our first automatic bale stacker in 1971 on the New Holland wagon. And that was at the time we were newly married, working at the university there, and it sure made a difference in the way agriculture looked, even though there was no money in farming at the time, the work wasn't so hard. So
and that wasn't a very automatic stacker.
Well, that was the second one, was the New Holland one. The one before that was, we had various things that had been tried. We had what was called McLean bale wagon, and you made the stack on it by hand, which was still a lot of work, but then the thing of it was is you could dump stuff back in the field and have enough right group of bale that would stand until fall when you could move them into storage, and you didn't have to. You cut out half the work. You didn't have to do the restacking that was there. There was always these bales, which was murder. There's seemingly nothing as hot as July in Saskatchewan, and that's the time of the year when you had the hay. I guess that my first memories of the early 50s, and that was still right tied on to the time when people used to thrash with bundles of grain or sheaves of grain and fork it and handle everything by hand, so that the type of work that was involved with all the farming wasn't that foreign. That was what the people had been raised at that time. But it sure wasn't appealing to anybody who was younger and was able to realize there was an easier way of doing it.
Yeah.
So now haying is extremely. It's not the big crew and the half a dozen men that it was back in those days. It is a job that's there that takes a week or two to do, and you get it done with, and that's part and parcel of the farm life. So
do you think your dad picked that quarter because it looked like the driest leaf trees in the whole country?
Where he homestead?
Yeah.
No, this was available.
Oh, okay.
By 1912, homestead land wasn't all that available.
Okay.
And Pete had found where he had, and that was as close to my uncle as Dad could get.
Pete is your uncle?
My uncle at homestead here first, Peter Higlin. And he had found a piece of land that was a half a mile from Cypress Lake. And the island in Cypress Lake eventually was named after him for his. He was very proud of his yard, and after he retired, he spent the last 20 years of his life making his yard into a showpiece. And his interest in horticulture, I guess, was rewarded with when they went to name the island in Cypress Lake. They named it after him.
Yeah, that's Hageland Island. That's a bird conservatory. Oh,
really?
Hageland Island, yeah. It's got cormorant nesting ground on it. That's why it's...
And white pelican.
Yeah, and the white pelicans are the two birds that they used to graze that island, but they don't anymore because of that. They used to ship cattle across. Well, you could tell better how they did that, but
Yeah. Various neighbors over the years had held a lease on the island, and they would take cattle over on a barge, have a floating thing, carry over cattle and leave them there for the summer. But at one time, the Department of Natural Resources decided what they wanted to do was foster the population of the white pelican and the cormorant that no longer were in the southern prairie, so they cut out the cattle grazing in Cypress Lake and turned it into a wildlife preserve. And one of the undesirable aspects of that is that Cypress Lake has been stripped of fish population because, of course, cormorants and pelicans have to feed them something, and they graze Cypress Lake pretty hard.
Wow. So they're not natural to...
I guess they are natural, but not within memory, the sort of thing is this one. They didn't survive with grazing the island. It took out, when cattle became popular, any of the nesting sites that cormorants and pelicans would have around water bodies tended to get disturbed and that sort of thing. So the cormorant pelican population just disappeared very early off the prairies. And so this was a move in the 60s to reestablish it. And it was successful. They reestablished cormorants and pelicans. But when I was a kid, I can remember going to Cypress Lake and fishing and catching perch and pickerel. And you would never do that now. There's no fish population catchable. I guess with Cypress Lake, there's always a conflict between using it as an irrigation reservoir and as a massive site. Because, like Sheila said, it's a big slough that's been dammed. Well, the the nature of it is that Cypress Lake, the height of it hasn't been changed by creating the dam. It's just the area that was left. And both on the east and the west side, by building dams, they trimmed the area that the water would go into a smaller area, so the level could be maintained easier. And before the days of construction of the dam, where Highway 21 goes north to Maple Creek, that flat that person transfers through there, that was always boggy, and because that had been about the margin or the shore of where Cypress Lake would have been at full level. So by building the dams, we made it easy to get north of the highway. The interesting thing is that you'll work with native elders, and the one thing that I get that livestock culture, the livestock industry makes one aware of is that the farm and cattle industry displaced the native population that was here, and the ranching sector prior to 1960, when agriculture or when haying was mechanized, the native population was an integral part of operation of ranches. If you didn't have the labor force, you couldn't operate a ranch. You didn't have the cowboys, you didn't have the fencing crews, you didn't have the haying crew, and the native population was an important part of it. Get into the 1960s, everything got mechanized. The haying got mechanized. The process of fencing became mechanized. What we used to call the willow or poplar picket fence posts that the native people would cut in the Cypress Hills and trees and bluestone, which was the standard fence post that was used. Okay, they would cut poplar or willow trees that were relatively small diameter, maybe an inch and a half to let's say two to 2.5 inches diameter, so the person could drive them with a hammer. And they were the standard fencing posts of the time. And the native population, that was their specialty. They cut them, they treated them in bluestone. They were a preserved post, and they would take them to town and trade or sell. And I can remember my dad finding out somebody had a load of good posts, they would buy them, that sort of thing. And that was the economic base of the native population, was working on the ranches and providing the fence posts. In the late 50s, Maple Creek had for a time a commercial fence post preserving company, and they harvested lodgepole pine out of the Cypress Hills, and they would pressure treat it. And so instead of the standard native fence post, you bought this commercial product, and the native population was very much marginalized. Within a very short period of time, their jobs on the ranch disappeared, and their products that they sold became obsolete. And it was very interesting what happened. And
Nickanique with a K, or is he? Nickanique is the one near
Maple Creek, yeah. Not being really involved, I couldn't really say. Yeah, not having viewed it from the native aspect, I wouldn't feel free to make a real final judgment. But they were indispensable.
Yeah.
I mean, the ranch couldn't have existed without their native workers. And I think that made respect. And the income levels, I mean, none of the ranchers were rich enough or that sort of stuff, that they would be from a different economic class.
Yeah.
And I guess the one thing you couldn't say they drank together, because back in that time Indians weren't allowed to have alcohol or anything like that, So that there was very much an institutional distinction, what as an Indian you could do, what as a white man you could do. You could work together all week, but when you went to town on Saturday night, if you wanted your Indian buddy to have a beer, you had to break the law to get it for them. Prior prior to refrigeration, which depended upon the electrical services of the farm. Supplying meat for the summer was a real problem. And the thing of it is, you could raise chickens, and you could have a chicken would be a sort of maybe a kill a chicken and would feed a family and that sort of thing. The secondary thing was if a ranch that had a labor force, they always had a herd of sheep because you could butcher a sheep, a smaller animal, and that was sort of it would make you could butcher it and eat it up before the meat would spoil. But for a farm, it was very short, isolated family, no hired men, not a big workforce. It was the chicken or the beef ring. And what the thing was every summer, they'd pick 20 weeks, I guess, probably between May and later. One person of the group, there'd be 20 members, would supply an animal that would be butchered. And it would be cut into 20 cuts. And so each member of the organization would get one of these cuts on a rotating basis. And so each week you got a fresh 1/20th of an animal which would provide meat for the traditional butchering day was Friday night. You'd pick up the meat on Saturday and it would be fresh for a Sunday roast and then whatever, and it would be carryover for the week. And I don't know how long it would last. If you were unlucky enough during the summer to get a chuck of neck, well, you'd have to can it. And have canned beef.
Canned beef, yeah.
But pork would be slaughtered in the fall, and you can have that carry over for when you can keep it frozen. And we were talking last night about the oat bin. Oats were traditionally very good insulator. So if you butchered your meat, you would bury it in a bin full of oats, and it would last on out through the spring, not in the summer, but it would keep meat frozen out into May. And it was more buried in a bin of oats. The other thing was the community telephone, long distance government or large company telephone lines didn't come into this area of Saskatchewan until
Well, when we were recording, you didn't have it.
No, 67. I don't know if they had it 68. Probably 68 or 69 as we got onto the telephone system down in this community. So before that, each relatively smaller area would have what they would call a fence line phone. It wasn't really on the fence, but the poles would be on the fence, and then there'd be a wire going around connecting them all up, and it would be a party line type of the local phone system. And there would be a work day both spring and fall that you would repair the fence line and make sure everything was working, and whether it needed new wire or new poles or that sort of thing. So that was another aspect of it, that community work. There is a cultural divide, and I think that a big part of it was that first of all, prior to the Second World War, farming was outside of the financial world pretty well. It didn't qualify really for business with the banks, and that was kind of more of a self-sufficient sort of a business. It had whereas ranching had a cash product, the cattle, and they were very much the people that produced cattle became part of the financial sector of the Canadian economy a lot earlier than agriculture did. So there was a difference there. The large ranchers that had a large cattle base, they were quite often quite dependent upon the financial institution, whereas farming was kind of besides. They weren't integrally tied into the financial world as much as the ranchers had been. I think in terms of it, I would have said, in my dad's time, if you were a rancher, that probably that you dealt with the bank, you had, you were probably dealing quite a bit more in the cash society than farmers were. Farmers were more subsistence, and not that much of a cash thing. However, since then it's changed, and I would say that probably the table has turned. Is that right now the farming, crop production is a far more capital intensive type operation than livestock is. But I really couldn't tell you the difference right now, except that I think the idea about ranching is that it's a far higher land base. Land is the important thing. If you've got lots of land, then it's a ranch. If you're working with inputs and trying to produce more off of less, then it becomes a farm, which is a very poor explanation. It's easier to explain what it used to be than what it is now.
Yeah, like when you call the place a ranch, we have to know. We can't be part of that. Like, not because you don't want to or anything, it's just because we are. Even though we have cattle.
The one thing that makes a very different social circle between farmers and ranchers is the concept of the branding. Because that's the one thing that has survived in modern ranching that takes a big labor force. Is when you work cattle, you still need lots of bodies, and the ranch community all get together to do their they brand, they do the roundup, they do the working of the cattle when everything that has to be done has to be, they do each person's individually, but the community comes to work for them that day.
And they rotate through a fairly long rotation.
Yes, and you have your day that you brand.
Yeah.
And that's inherited. If you want to change the day you brand, you have to move to a different community kind of thing, because you brand after so and so and before so and so. That's understood. As branding on a farm, you tend to try to do it mechanically, and then you find out where is there a labor supply that you can have, because you don't want to be spending a week going around 10 days branding in return for the people that you've had at your branding. So that's a very interesting aspect of it all. But farming tends to be a far more independent, that it is mechanized to the point that you're separate from the rest of the community pretty well. You do your seeding, your harvest, all that sort of stuff. You never come together for any common purpose.
It's interesting because it's such a big question. What's the difference between ranching and farming? And so there's so many different factors that play into that.
And because I'm an outsider, like one of the things that struck me when I got to the school teaching is the kindergarten, grade 2, quite often if they square off in the playground, it's between ranchers and farmers. Like, that can be very insulting to a 5-year-old to be called a rancher when he's a farmer, or a farmer when he's a rancher, the other way around. And I thought, whoa, I've never been to school where
where you didn't have to be black or white, you just do the shape of boots you wore.
The shape of your boots.
And I mean, they're all good friends, but they have to get their little
stake out the territory.
Yeah,
they're carving out their identity.
And when they get to school, they maybe start to cross with these people of a different culture. It would be in a big city, and that hits them when they're at school. Probably less when they're in play schools and stuff. But I mean, I literally have seen lots of. I am not a farmer. I'm a rancher. Kind of thing. So there's.
Because I can remember when I started school, we went to the country school that was 2 miles away. And
here?
Pardon?
When you started school?
Yes.
Is there a school? Same school?
No.
Country school, or it's gone? Or?
Oh, it's been gone for many years.
Where was it, or what was its name?
Cypress Lake.
Cypress Lake School.
Yeah.
Okay.
It had been, its original name, when it was in the original site, had been Gopher. Real outstanding classy name. But the area where it was built by 1920 it had been depopulated. So they moved the school up close to Cypress Lake where people were still living on the farms. And I started school there in 51, or 50 I guess it was. Back at that time school year started in February. We didn't have a summer break except for maybe a short period. But school ran from early February on through till the end of June. And then they took a short break and then started again and ran till Christmas. And they had a 6-week break over January, late December, January, early February, when there was no school because it was cold and stormy and you couldn't make it to school and that sort of thing. And so that was my first year started. I started the new school year in February, but the next year we were modernizing the thing. So a new school year started that August. So everybody's school year that year got shortened by 6 months.
Oh my God.
So we only had 6 months. I only had 6 months of school. So anyway, then when our school district was in 1954, when they went to the school buses and went to the town, our school district was cut right down the middle. We went to Robstar School, which had a school then, and our neighbors to the west went to Consol. And if you had gone to, if you went to Robstar, you definitely knew that Consol was the social dregs of the world. Do you ever watch Corner Gas? Okay, Dog River, what's the name of the other place?
We'll be gone. Yeah.
But that's very much, it seems to be the nature of the human beast to try to figure out a way to distinguish them from somebody else.
But you ran on horseback.
Well, yeah, I had to ride horse at school for up till grade 4.
The Army ladies.
But that was a trick when I was young, first years going. I didn't have my own horse. I had to ride behind my sister on the horse to school. First I thought, you behave or I'm going to trot the horse all the way home. And I knew it was a threat.
Is she still in the region?
Yes, we farm with her. She
lives on the ranch that we got from non-timber.
She lives down there. She's the operator, I guess you could say.
The ranch, not the farm.
Yeah.
And she probably is a ranch. There's family divisions.
I guess the one thing I'd like to add that I haven't had anything to say about was my cousin had worked on the construction of the dam. It had been done before I was born, so I didn't have anything to do with it. I had an older cousin that worked on it. And the interesting thing was, from his perspective, the job wasn't to build a dam, it was to keep people busy. And when he talked about all the things that they did, it was always to extract the maximum amount of work out of any sort of a job to make it as long as it could. They did, the best example he gave me, as I can remember, is they did concrete work to build the structures on the dam. And so they would have to bring gravel over to where the dams were to mix the cement. And they had they had mechanical implements. But what they did was they pushed the dirt off the top of the gravel pile, and then they had men load the trucks with a shovel, because men could do that. They couldn't get rid of the dirt off the top effectively, but they could keep a lot of men busy shoveling gravel and with dump trucks to haul it through the cement plant.
And the grader was sitting right there. It could have scooped it in.
Well, the dozer that could have pushed into the truck, but they didn't do things that way. So
nutrient full scale.
Make-work projects.
Yeah.
Which I don't know whether we still have them in this day and age or not, but it was the thought process of that time. I guess we probably still have it, just don't recognize them.
And the dam was built, what year?
37, 38.
Right.
The lake was dry in 1937, as my cousin talked about. They were working on both dams at the same time, so the engineer had a trail that ran down the lake bed between the two dams while they were working.
This cousin, what was his name?
Lloyd Hegland.
Lloyd.
He died a couple of years ago.